The Winchester's report echoed across the valley like thunder, followed by an eerie silence that made even the horses pause their nervous shuffling. Ezra Mason's weathered hands remained steady on the reins, his eyes fixed on the three riders approaching through the desert heat. 10 years. It had been 10 years since he'd last drawn his gun in anger, and he'd hoped never to do it again. But as the sound of hoofbeats grew closer, he knew some choices weren't his to make. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Rattlesnake Junction's only street, as Ezra Mason prepared the day's stage for its journey west. His fingers, calloused from years of handling reins rather than revolvers, methodically checked each trace and buckle. The routine was as familiar to him now as drawing and firing had once been. "Another beautiful morning for a ride, wouldn't you say, Mr. Mason?" Sarah Thompson called from the station's porch, where she sat mending mailbags. The postmaster's daughter had grown from a pigtailed child to a capable young woman during Ezra's 5 years driving the Junction to Fort Davis route. "That it is, Miss Sarah," he replied, his voice carrying the soft drawl of East Texas timber country rather than the harsh accent of the western plains. Though them clouds on the horizon might have other ideas, the Stagecoach station was coming alive around them. Porter Williams, the station master, emerged from his office with the day's manifest, while 2 ranch hands loaded the last of the freight. The familiar bustle of morning departures helped quiet the ghosts that sometimes still walked with Ezra, especially on days like this when the air felt heavy with possibility. "Light passenger load today," Porter announced, adjusting his wire-rimmed spectacles. "Just the Reverend Curtis heading to Fort Stockton and Mrs. Henderson visiting her sister in Fort Davis." Ezra nodded, grateful for the simple work that had become his life. There was peace in these morning rituals, in the honest labor of moving people and goods across the vast Texas landscape. It was different from the life he'd led before, when his name had been whispered in saloons from El Paso to San Antonio. The passengers arrived as the station clock struck 7. Reverend Curtis, tall and rail-thin in his black coat, offered a quiet blessing before climbing aboard. Mrs. Henderson, a widow who made the journey west twice a year, settled in with her usual dignity and collection of carpetbags. As Ezra climbed to the driver's box, his fingers brushed against the worn leather of his gun belt, a habit he'd never quite broken. The Colt Peacemaker rode high on his hip, its presence a concession to the dangers of the trail rather than a reminder of his past. Few knew that the quiet stagecoach driver had once been known as Lightning Mason, the man who'd outdrawn the notorious Jackson brothers in the streets of Laredo. That had been another life before the incident in Amarillo that had left him with a chest full of lead and a soul heavy with regret. He'd found redemption in the simple work of driving stages, in delivering mail and passengers safely across the dangerous country between settlements. The regularity of it had helped heal wounds that went deeper than bullet scars. All secured. "Mr. Mason," young Tommy Williams called up, the station master's son having finished his inspection of the cargo. At 12, the boy reminded Ezra of himself at that age, before gunsmoke and violence had changed his path. With a practiced flick of the reins, Ezra set the 4-horse team in motion. The stage rolled past the last buildings of Rattlesnake Junction, the morning sun warming his shoulders as the familiar trail stretched westward. The first leg would take them to Coyote Wells, a 6-hour run across open country that had seen its share of Indian raids and bandit attacks. But those threats seemed distant on this spring morning, with meadowlarks calling from the scrub brush, and the wheels turning steadily beneath him. Inside the coach, he could hear Reverend Curtis sharing stories of his missionary work with Mrs. Henderson, their voices a comfortable backdrop to the journey. As they crossed Wolf Creek, Ezra allowed himself a small smile, 5 years ago, he'd arrived in Rattlesnake Junction with nothing but his reputation and a desire to disappear. The town had given him something he'd never expected to find, a chance to be judged by his actions rather than his legend. The peace of the morning was broken by a dust cloud on the horizon, moving fast and purposeful. Ezra's eyes narrowed as he counted the riders, 3 of them pushing their horses hard. His right hand twitched slightly, muscle memory from years of reading Trouble on the Wind. But he forced himself to remain calm, to remember that not every approaching rider meant danger. Still, as the morning sun caught the metal of gun barrels, a familiar tension began to build in his chest. Some men spent their whole lives running from who they used to be. Ezra Mason had thought he'd finally managed it, had believed the ghost of Lightning Mason was finally laid to rest. But as the riders drew closer, their intentions becoming clear, in the way they spread out across the trail, he realized that sometimes the past had other plans. The question now was whether he could protect his passengers without becoming the man he'd tried so hard to leave behind. The 3 riders closed the distance with practiced efficiency. Their horses, dark with sweat, kicked up clouds of red dust. As they maneuvered to surround the stage, Ezra noted their positions with the tactical eye he'd never quite lost. 1 ahead to block the trail, 2 spreading wide to cut off any escape. "Might want to hold tight," he called down to his passengers, keeping his voice steady. Inside the coach, Reverend Curtis's sermon fell silent, replaced by Mrs. Henderson's sharp intake of breath. The leader, a rough-looking man with a crossed bandolier and a week's worth of beard, raised his hand. "That's far enough, driver." Ezra drew the stage to a halt, sizing up their visitors. The leader wore his gun low, cavalry style, while his companions, younger, nervous-looking men, had their revolvers stuck through their belts like amateurs. All 3 wore dusters covered in trail dust, marking them as outlaws rather than locals. "Afternoon, gentlemen," Ezra said mildly, his East Texas drawl more pronounced than usual. "Something I can help you with?" The leader's horse, a raw-boned bay, pranced sideways. "Wells Fargo shipment. We know you're carrying it." A bead of sweat rolled down Ezra's neck, but his hands remained steady on the reins. "Afraid you've got bad information, friend. This is just the regular mail run to Fort Davis. Don't play stupid," the man on the right snapped, younger and more aggressive than his leader. "Station master signed for it yesterday, 10,000 in the Army payroll." Ezra's mind raced. The Army payroll had indeed arrived yesterday, but Porter Williams had arranged for it to go out on tomorrow's stage, escorted by a cavalry detail. These men had good intelligence, but not good enough. "Check the strongbox, Jake," the leader ordered, and the youngest outlaw dismounted, spurs jingling. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Inside the coach, Reverend Curtis had begun to pray quietly. Ezra could feel Mrs. Henderson's eyes on him through the window, worried but trusting. They were his responsibility, these passengers who'd placed their lives in his hands. "Ma'am, Reverend," he called down softly, "when I give the word, I need you both to get down on the floor and stay there." The young outlaw, Jake, reached for the strongbox mounted behind the boot. His hand never made it. In one fluid motion that spoke of thousands of hours of practice, Ezra's Colt seemed to materialize in his hand. "Son," he said quietly, "I wouldn't." The leader's eyes narrowed, recognition finally dawning. "Well, I'll be damned. Boys, you know who we got here. This here's Lightning Mason himself." Jake froze, his face going pale. Even out here, it seemed, some legends refused to die. "That was a lifetime ago," Ezra replied, his voice carrying across the suddenly still afternoon. "I'm just a stage driver now, but I'm still responsible for my passengers and cargo, so I'm giving you boys one chance to ride away." The leader's laugh was ugly. "Lightning Mason? 10 years back, maybe that name meant something. Now, you're just An old man playing at honest work. 3 guns against 1 old-timer. Those odds don't favor you. Down! Ezra barked at his passengers, and then the world exploded into motion. The leader was good. His gun cleared leather fast enough that most men would have been dead before they could react. But Ezra Mason hadn't earned his nickname by being most men. His first shot took the leader's gun arm at the shoulder, sending the man's wild shot harmlessly into the sky. Jake, still near the strongbox, went for his pistol with the young man's confidence and old man's speed. Ezra's second shot knocked the gun from his hand in a spray of blood and steel. The third outlaw managed to fire twice, bullets whining past Ezra's ear, before a third crack of the Colt sent him tumbling from his saddle. The entire exchange had taken less than 3 seconds. "Jesus Christ!" Jake whispered, cradling his bleeding hand. His leader lay in the dust, cursing through clenched teeth, while the third man rolled on the ground, clutching his thigh where Ezra's bullet had found him. "There's a doctor in Rattlesnake Junction," Ezra said, his voice unchanged from its earlier pleasantness. "About 4 hours back the way you came, if you ride slowly and carefully. I'd suggest you help your friends mount up and head that direction." The afternoon was silent except for the wounded men's ragged breathing and the nervous shifting of horses. Inside the coach, Reverend Curtis had stopped praying. "You could have killed us," the leader managed through pale lips. "Yes," Ezra agreed, simply. "I could have." He didn't add that the man he'd been 10 years ago would have done exactly that. The stagecoach driver had learned mercy in ways the gunfighter never had. It took the outlaws nearly 10 minutes to get mounted up, helping their wounded leader into the saddle. Jake, the youngest, looked back once before they rode east, his eyes wide with the kind of fear that would fuel campfire stories for years to come. Only when their dust had settled did Ezra finally holster his gun. His hands were still steady, but something inside him trembled like a plucked string. 5 years of peace shattered in 3 seconds of violence. "My word," Mrs. Henderson said shakily as she emerged from the floor of the coach. "Mr. Mason, I had no idea." "Are you both all right?" he asked, deliberately turning the conversation. "Thanks to you," Reverend Curtis replied, his clerical collar slightly askew. "Though I confess, I find myself wrestling with the Christian response to such violence." Ezra managed a small smile. "Sometimes Reverend Mercy wears strange clothes. Even a gunfighter can learn that." But as he clucked the horses back into motion, Ezra felt the weight of the gun on his hip more heavily than he had in years. Word would spread from this day's work. Lightning Mason was still alive, still deadly. The quiet life he'd built might have just gotten considerably louder. The stage rolled westward under the Texas sun, and Ezra Mason wondered if a man could ever truly choose who he was, or if some brands went soul-deep, permanent as bullet scars, and twice as lasting. The answers, like the horizon, stretched out before him, and all he could do was drive on and meet them as they came. Hours passed in tense silence, broken only by the rhythmic creaking of leather and wood. As they approached Coyote Wells, the sun high overhead cast harsh shadows across the desert scrub. Ezra's thoughts kept returning to the young outlaw's face, Jake, and the way recognition had drained the color from it. He'd seen that look before, in Laredo, in El Paso, in a dozen dusty towns where his reputation had preceded him. The station at Coyote Wells appeared through the heat shimmer, a collection of adobe buildings and corrals that marked the halfway point to Fort Davis. As they drew closer, Ezra noted something off about the usual bustle of the way station. The afternoon stage from the west should have arrived by now, but the station yard was empty, save for a single saddled horse. "Something ain't right," he muttered, drawing the team to a halt 50 yards from the station. The hair on the back of his neck stood up, the same warning sense that had kept him alive through countless showdowns. "Is there a problem, Mr. Mason?" Reverend Curtis asked, leaning out the window. Before Ezra could answer, a shot rang out from the station building. The bullet whined past, missing the driver's box by inches. In the same instant, riders emerged. From behind the station, 6 of them, all armed. "Those boys worked faster than I expected," Ezra said quietly, recognizing the implications. The outlaws hadn't just had good intelligence about the payroll. They'd had a backup plan. "Lightning Mason," a voice called from the station. "That was just to get your attention. Throw down your gun and step away from the stage." Ezra's mind raced. 6 guns now, not 3, and his passengers are still at risk. The odds had just gotten considerably worse, but as he studied the positions of the gunmen, a plan began to form. Sometimes, he reflected, a reputation could be as useful as a loaded gun. The real question was whether he could live with being Lightning Mason one more time, knowing what that name had cost him in the past. But as he heard Mrs. Henderson's quiet prayer from inside the coach, he realized some choices had already been made for him. The standoff at Coyote Wells stretched like a bowstring in the afternoon heat. Ezra's mind calculated angles and distances, the old arithmetic of survival, coming back as naturally as breathing. 6 gunmen positioned with military precision. These weren't common bandits. "I won't ask again, Mason." The voice from the station carried authority, practiced command. "Your reputation is not worth dying for." Ezra's reply was to smoothly step down from the driver's box, his movements deliberate and unhurried. "Reverend Mrs. Henderson, stay inside and keep low." His boots raised small puffs of dust as he walked forward, away from the stage. "Wise choice." The voice approved. A figure emerged from the station's shadows, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a Confederate cavalry officer's coat despite the heat. "Colonel James Blackwood, formerly of the 3rd Texas Cavalry. I've waited a long time for this meeting." Recognition hit Ezra like a physical blow. Amarillo. 10 years ago, the firefight that had left him full of lead and haunted by regret. He'd never seen the face of the man who'd ordered that ambush, but he'd heard the name whispered in saloons across Texas. "The war's been over a long time, Colonel," Ezra said quietly. Blackwood's laugh was sharp as broken glass. "Some wars never end. Mason, you made sure of that when you killed my brother in that Amarillo courthouse. Your brother was shooting unarmed civilians. He was executing Union sympathizers." Blackwood's composure cracked. "And you gunned him down like a dog in the street." The other gunmen had edged closer during the exchange, their weapons trained on Ezra. Among them, he recognized Jake from the earlier confrontation, his bandaged hand testament to their previous meeting. The boy's eyes held a mixture of fear and vengeful anticipation. "I count 6 guns against 1, Blackwood continued, regaining his calm. "Even Lightning Mason can't beat those odds. But I'm a sportsman. Throw down your gun and I'll let your passengers ride away unharmed before we finish our business." Inside the coach, Reverend Curtis had begun another prayer. The words drifted across the station yard, incongruous against the tension. "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death." Your passengers' lives against your pride, Mason. Choose quickly. Ezra's hand hung near his holster, time stretching like molasses. In his mind's eye, he saw the Amarillo courthouse again. The screams, the gunsmoke, the way Blackwood's brother had reached for the sky as Ezra's bullets found him. He remembered the weight of his choices that day, and every day since. "I fear no evil," the Reverend's voice continued, "stronger now." "Times change, Colonel," Ezra said softly. "Men change too, if they're given the chance." "Not all men," Blackwood replied, his hand dropping to his gun. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion, each moment crystal clear in the afternoon light. Blackwood was fast, his draw a blur of motion, but Ezra had already begun to move. The first shot came from behind the station, a warning Blackwood hadn't authorized, and in that moment of chaos, Lightning Mason emerged from his long slumber. Ezra's first bullet caught the shooter behind the station, his second found. Jake's remaining good hand before the boy could level his weapon. As he rolled behind a water trough, 2 more shots sent Blackwood's flanking gunman scrambling for cover. "For thou art with me." The Reverend's prayer rose above the gunfire. Blackwood's bullet splintered wood inches from Ezra's head. Another. Shot and pain bloomed along his ribs. A graze, nothing more. 4 shots left in the Colt, 4 targets remaining. "Your rod and your staff, they comfort me." 2 quick shots drove Blackwood's remaining men back, pinning them behind the stations. Corner. In the confusion, Mrs. Henderson's voice joined the Reverend's prayer, their words a strange counterpoint to the gunfight. Blackwood emerged from cover, both guns blazing. Ezra's return fire caught him high in the chest, spinning him halfway around. The colonel's shots went wide, kicking up dust as he fell. "Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of my enemies." The remaining gunmen, seeing their leader fall, broke and ran for their horses. Ezra let them go, his gun trained on Blackwood's prone form. The station yard fell silent, except for the thunder of retreating hoofbeats and the final words of the psalm, "Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life." Ezra approached Blackwood carefully, keeping his weapon ready. The colonel lay gasping in the dust, blood spreading across his grey coat. His eyes, when they met Ezra's, held neither fear nor acceptance, only the same burning hatred that had fueled him for 10 years. "Finish it," Blackwood wheezed. "Like you finished him." Instead, Ezra knelt beside his fallen enemy. "The war's over, Colonel. Has been for a long time. Let it rest." "Never." Blood flecked Blackwood's lips. "Others will come. Old debts don't die easily." "No," Ezra agreed softly. "But men do, unless they learn to let them go." He stayed with Blackwood until the end, watching as the hatred in those eyes slowly faded to confusion, then to a final, empty stillness. When it was done, he stood slowly, feeling every one of his years. "And I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever," Reverend Curtis finished. His psalm, the words hanging in the afternoon air like a benediction. Ezra checked the station and found the regular staff tied up in the barn, shaken but unharmed. As he helped free them, Mrs. Henderson and the Reverend emerged from the coach, their faces pale but composed. "You did what you had to," Reverend Curtis said quietly, looking at Blackwood's body. "God's mercy works through many hands." "Even blood-stained ones, Reverend. Especially those, Mr. Mason. For they know best the price of violence and the value of mercy." As the station hands began to restore order, Ezra found himself staring west toward Fort Davis and the mountains beyond. The ghost of Lightning Mason had risen again today, and he wondered how many more old debts would come calling before they'd let him rest. But for now, there were passengers to deliver, a stage to drive, and miles of open country ahead. The past might never fully release its grip, but perhaps that was the price of redemption, to carry its weight until the burden became wisdom. As they prepared to continue their journey, Ezra discovered a leather document case among Blackwood's belongings. Inside, yellowed papers revealed a deeper conspiracy. Maps marking stage routes, schedules, and a list of names. Some were crossed out, others circled in red ink. His own name was at the bottom, underlined 3 times. "Found something interesting. In the Colonel's effects," the station master said, approaching with a tin star pinned to his vest. "Seems he wasn't working alone." He handed Ezra a letter bearing the seal of the defunct Confederacy. The letter spoke of a group called the Grey Ghosts, former Confederate officers who refused to accept defeat, targeting those they blamed for their losses. Blackwood had been their sword arm, but not their head. "Marshall's been tracking them for months," the station master continued. "Might be interested in knowing what happened here today." Ezra folded the papers carefully. "Might be more interested in what's still to come." These men, he tapped the list of names, they're all like me, folks who fought against the Confederacy, tried to build new lives after. Vengeance dies hard in Texas, that it does. Ezra tucked the documents into his coat, but so do some of us who carry its weight. The fresh team was hitched, the stage ready to roll. As Ezra climbed back to his seat, he felt the familiar weight of his gun, but now it carried new meaning. The quiet life he'd built wasn't just his refuge anymore. It was a fortress others might need if the grey ghosts came hunting. "Fort Davis before sundown?" Mrs. Henderson asked as they pulled out, her voice steady despite all they'd witnessed. "God willing," Ezra replied, though he knew now that peace would require more than prayer. The road west stretched before them, and somewhere out there other ghosts waited to rise. Fort Davis loomed against the twilight sky, its stone walls still holding the day's heat as Ezra guided the stage through the gates. The journey from Coyote Wells had been mercifully quiet, but the documents in his coat weighed heavier than any bullet wound. "Stage to Rattlesnake Junction," the sentry called out, torchlight flickering across his young face. "Been expecting you since noon." The delay at Coyote Wells had cost them hours, but Ezra noticed something odd in the soldier's tone, a tension that spoke of more than just a late arrival. As they pulled into the fort's staging area, he saw why. A dozen riders were saddled up, equipped for hard travel, with a familiar figure at their head. Mason, U.S. Marshal Calvin Wade, stepped forward, his voice carrying the authority of 20 years wearing the star. "Heard you had some trouble back at Coyote Wells." Ezra set the brake and climbed down slowly, conscious of the eyes watching from the fort's shadows. News travels fast. Faster than a stage sometimes. Wade gestured toward the command building. "Colonel Harrison wants a word." Inside the fort's headquarters, Colonel James Harrison stood studying a map spread across his desk, pins marking locations across West Texas. The cavalry officer's perfect posture spoke of West Point training, but the scars on his hands told of frontier battles. "Mr. Mason," Harrison looked up as they entered, "or should I say Lightning Mason?" "Just Mason will do, Colonel." "Indeed." Harrison tapped the map. 3 stage stations hit in the past month. Wells Fargo's strongboxes cleaned out, but that's not their real purpose. They're hunting men like you, those who fought against the Confederacy's excesses during the war. Ezra placed Blackwood's documents on the desk. "Grey ghosts, Harrison's." Eyes narrowed as he examined the papers. "So it's true. We'd heard rumors of an organization, but this—" He held up the list of names. "These men need to be warned." "Already lost 4, Wade added. "Good men, trying to live quiet lives. Found them hanging from telegraph poles, grey ribbons pinned to their chests." The implications settled like lead in Ezra's stomach. "How many Ghost Riders?" "At least 30, Harrison replied, led by former Confederate General Marcus Vance. "Man's got a talent for turning defeat into a holy crusade. And now you want my help hunting them?" It wasn't a question. Wade shifted uncomfortably. "Ain't just about hunting, Mason. These men, the ones on that list, they trust you. Some rode with you during the war. They'll listen if you warn them." "I gave up that life." "Life might not be done with you," Harrison said quietly. "General Vance doesn't distinguish between past and present. To him, every man who opposed the Confederacy's cause is still an enemy. Even those who just tried to protect innocent lives." Memories of Amarillo surfaced again, not just the courthouse shooting, but the days before. The Confederate raiders targeted civilian supplies, shooting farmers who resisted, all in the name of a lost cause. Ezra had stopped them, but the cost— "I drive stages now," he said firmly. "Found peace in honest work." "Peace?" Wade's voice held an edge. "Tell that to Tom Burke. Man saved 30 freedmen from Confederate raiders in '63. Found him 2 weeks ago, strung up outside Austin. His wife, too. Harrison pushed a letter across the desk. This arrived yesterday. General Vance sends his regards, says he's coming to Fort Davis personally. Seems Blackwood's death got his attention. Then let your cavalry handle it. Cavalry. Can't be everywhere, Harrison replied. But a stage driver? Man who knows every trail and waterhole between here and El Paso? Men these old soldiers might trust with their lives? That's worth more than a regiment. Ezra stared at the map, at the pins marking places where good men had died. And if I refuse? Then we respect your choice, Wade said. But those names on that list, their blood's on all our hands if we don't try to save them. A knock at the door interrupted them. A young lieutenant entered, face flushed with urgency. Colonel, rider from Fort Stockton. Gray ghosts hit the Thompson ranch, set it ablaze with the family inside. Harrison's face hardened. Survivors. Youngest girl made it out. Said they asked about a man named Mason before they started the fire. The words hung in the air like smoke. Ezra felt the weight of his gun, of his choices, of the lives that might depend on what he decided in this moment. I'd need conditions, he said finally. Wade and Harrison exchanged glances. Name them, the colonel replied. First, I keep driving. Best way to move without drawing attention. And I meant what I said about honest work. Agreed. Second, we warn. These men quietly. No pauses, no cavalry patrols drawing attention. Let me handle it my way. Harrison nodded. Within reason. Third, Ezra's voice hardened. When we find Vance, he's mine. Not the army's, not the law's. This ends the old way between him and me. Wade started to object, but Harrison raised a hand. Agreed. But you work with us, Mason. Share what you learn, coordinate your movements. These ghosts have a network. We need to unravel it, not just cut off its head. One more thing. Ezra tapped the list of names. Some of these men won't want to run. They've built lives like I did. They'll need protection. Already thought of that, Wade said. Armies setting up safe havens, places they can bring their families. Harrison's got a plan to make it look like regular homesteader settlements. Outside, the fort's evening bugle call echoed off the stone walls. Ezra thought of Sarah Thompson back in Rattlesnake Junction, of Porter Williams and his son Tommy. Simple folks living simple lives, the kind of peace he'd found after years of violence. Now that peace was threatened not just for him, but for others who'd tried to leave the past behind. I'll need to send word to Rattlesnake Junction, he said. Let them know I'm still driving the route, but things might get complicated. Harrison began marking new positions on his map. We'll have men watching the stations, but subtle-like. As far as anyone knows, you're just another stage driver going about his business. And the Grey Ghosts, let them come looking for Lightning Mason. Wade smiled grimly. They might not like what they find. As Ezra left the headquarters, the stars were emerging above Fort Davis's walls. Somewhere out there, General Vance and his ghosts were planning their next move, hunting men whose only crime had been standing against tyranny in its hour of strength. The stage would roll east tomorrow, back toward Rattlesnake Junction. But now each turn of the wheels would carry more than just mail and passengers. It would carry hope for men marked for death, and a reckoning long overdue. Before leaving the fort, Ezra made one final stop at the telegraph office. The operator, a wizened man named Whitaker, looked up from his key with knowing eyes. Need to send a message, Ezra said, sliding a piece of paper across the desk. Private wire to Judge Nathan Cole in Austin. Whitaker's eyebrows rose as he read. The brief message. Cipher code. Ain't used this one since the war. Some ghosts need special handling, Ezra replied. Judge Cole had been his contact during the war, coordinating resistance against Confederate raiders. If anyone could help identify potential ghost targets, it would be him. The telegraph key began its rhythmic clicking, sending words that would make no sense to anyone intercepting them. But to Judge Cole, they would tell a story of rising dangers and the need for old alliances to reform. Back in his quarters, Ezra spread Blackwood's documents across the bed. Among them, a fragment of a letter caught his eye. Something about a gathering of ghost leaders planned for the coming month. The location was encoded, but one detail stood out: the place where the betrayal began. A cold certainty settled in his gut. Amarillo. Where else would Vance choose to launch his campaign? Of vengeance? The courthouse where Blackwood's brother had died still stood, a fitting stage for the general's twisted sense of justice. A knock at his door revealed Mrs. Henderson, her usual composed demeanor showing cracks of concern. "Mr. Mason, I couldn't help but overhear some of what's happening. My late husband spoke of you, you know, from the war." Ezra's surprise must have shown on his face. "Jonathan Henderson," she continued. "He ran supplies through Confederate lines to freed slaves and Union sympathizers. Said a man named Lightning Mason saved his life more than once." The name hit Ezra like a physical blow. "John. Big John Henderson. I didn't know he'd pneumonia 2 winters ago." Her voice softened. "But he never forgot what you and others did during those dark days. There are more of us who remember Mr. Mason. More. Who'll stand with you if you let us." The offer hung in the air between them, a reminder that even in his quest for a quiet life, he'd touched others in ways he'd never known. The stage driver's simple existence had been a mask, but perhaps not a false one, just incomplete. "Thank you, Mrs. Henderson," he said finally, "but this time staying uninvolved might be the wisest course." She squared her shoulders, looking remarkably like her late husband at that moment. "Wisdom and right aren't always the same thing, Mr. Mason. John taught me that." As she left, Ezra returned to the documents, seeing them with new eyes. Each name on Vance's list represented not just a target, but a web of connections, families, friends, people who remembered what it meant to stand against tyranny. Tomorrow the stage would roll east, carrying mail, passengers, and secrets. But it would also carry something else. The first threads of a network that might just be strong enough to strangle Vance's ghosts in their own noose. Dawn painted Fort Davis's walls blood red as Ezra checked the stage's team. The morning air carried a bite that spoke of approaching winter, though summer's heat would return by noon. As he worked, his mind traced the route ahead: Coyote Wells, now under cavalry watch, then the long stretch to Rattlesnake Junction. Interesting cargo today. Porter Williams's brother, Franklin, emerged from the fort's storage room carrying a wooden crate. The station master's network extended far beyond their small town. Army requisition papers say it's medical supplies. Ezra helped him secure the crate in the strongbox. And what do your eyes say? Ammunition. Winchester rounds by the weight. Franklin lowered his voice. "Being delivered to every station between here and El Paso. Armies preparing for something big." A squad of cavalry rode past, their early patrol stirring dust in the courtyard. Among them, Ezra spotted Wade's deputy, young Bill Hawkins, wearing civilian clothes and riding a plain brown mare instead of an army mount. The marshal was already putting pieces in place. "First passengers are here." Franklin nodded toward the fort's guest quarters. A tall man in a banker's suit approached, helping a woman in a dark traveling dress. Something about their movements caught Ezra's attention. The way they scanned their surroundings, how they kept their backs to walls. These weren't ordinary travelers. Mr. and Mrs. Smith, the man introduced themselves, his accent pure Boston despite his Texas tan. "We're traveling to El Paso on business." Ezra recognized the code phrase from his war days. These were some of Judge Cole's people already responding to last night's telegraph. The network was awakening faster than he'd expected. "Welcome aboard," he replied with the countersign. Weather should hold fair at Rattlesnake Junction. As they climbed into the coach, a commotion drew attention to the fort's gates. A rider was approaching hard, his horse lathered with sweat. The guards recognized him. One of Wade's deputies out of Fort Stockton. "Marshal," the rider called, out, spotting Wade emerging from the headquarters. "Got word from Austin. Judge Cole's courthouse was hit last night." Ezra's blood ran cold. The judge had been on Vance's list, but he'd thought there was more time. Wade strode over, his face grim. "Cole? Alive but wounded, shot twice trying to protect his clerk." The deputy handed over a crumpled paper. "Left this pinned to his door." Ezra moved closer as Wade read the message, close enough to see the grey ribbon attached to its corner. The words were few but carried weight. "Justice comes for all betrayers. Amarillo awaits." "They're moving faster than we thought," Wade muttered. "Pushing us to react." "Or pushing me," Ezra replied quietly. "Vance knows I'll read about Cole. Knows what it'll do." The marshal studied him. "Are you thinking of changing the plan?" "Plan's already changed. They hit Cole first for a reason. He knew every resistance route, every safe house, from here to Louisiana. With him wounded, the whole network's exposed," Wade finished. "Every man on that list is in immediate danger." Ezra glanced at the stage where the Smiths waited. More would be coming, he knew. Other survivors of the war, seeking protection or offering help. But they'd need time to gather, time to rebuild the old connections. "I'm changing course," he decided. "Take the high road through Apache country. Longer route, but fewer places for ambush." Apache territory's its own kind of dangerous. Better Apache than ghosts. At least with Apache you know where you stand. Ezra checked his gun, more from habit than need. "Send word to Rattlesnake Junction. Have them redirect any special passengers to Fort Stockton instead. Safer there." Wade nodded to his deputy, who rode out immediately. "What about you?" "I'll keep driving. Stay visible. Let Vance think his plan's working, that he's herding me toward Amarillo, while we move the others to safety behind your screen." Wade understood. "Risky play. Man wants to resurrect ghosts." Ezra mounted the driver's box. "Let's give him something to haunt him." The stage rolled out under the strengthening sun, hooves and wheels raising dust that glowed like gold in the morning light. Inside, the Smiths carried messages and plans that would help rebuild the old resistance network. In the strong box, ammunition waited for hands that would need it. But as they climbed into the hills above Fort Davis, Ezra's thoughts turned to Sarah Thompson, back in Rattlesnake Junction. She'd see through any attempt to hide the truth. Her father had been part of the Underground Railroad during the war, and she'd inherited his sharp eyes. The question wasn't whether she'd understand, but whether understanding would put her in danger. Vance's men would be watching everyone connected to Lightning Mason, looking for leverage, for weakness, for ways to force his hand. A glint of metal on a distant ridge caught his eye. Sunlight on a spyglass lens, quickly hidden. They were being watched, as he'd expected. The game was already in motion, pieces moving across a board that stretched from El Paso to Austin. The Smiths were discussing business in carefully coded phrases, their words carrying messages that would help protect others on Vance's list. But Ezra heard the fear beneath their cultured accents. They'd lived through the war, seen what men like Vance were capable of when their cause turned holy. A raven circled overhead, its shadow crossing the stage like a portent. Ezra touched the papers hidden in his coat, the list of names, the coded messages, the map showing Vance's suspected movements. Each piece told part of a story, but the whole truth remained elusive. The truth of war, he reflected, was that it never really ended. It just changed shape, traded uniforms for shadows, battlefields for backrooms. But some things remained constant. The cost of standing against tyranny, the price of protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. The stage rolled on, each turn of the wheels carrying them deeper into uncertain territory. Behind them, Fort Davis grew small against the horizon. Ahead, the high country waited, where Apache shadows moved like ghosts among the rocks, and every trail could lead to sanctuary or ambush. The war wasn't over. It had just been waiting, patient as a rattler in the shade, for the right moment to strike. And now the poison of old hatreds was spreading again, turning good men into hunters, peaceful towns into battlefields. But this time, Lightning Mason wasn't just fighting for justice. He was fighting for the quiet life he'd built, for the people who trusted him, for all those who'd thought the past was finally buried. The ghosts of war might never rest, but neither would the will to stand against them. The stage crested a rise, revealing the vastness of Apache country before them. Among the rocks, Ezra spotted movement, native scouts tracking their progress. Unlike Vance's men, the Apache made no effort to hide their presence. It was their way of announcing terms. Passage would be tolerated, but not guaranteed. Company. Ahead, he called down to his passengers. Through the swirling dust, 3 riders approached. Not Apache, but not ghost riders either. He recognized the lead rider's distinctive cavalry seat. Mason, Captain Samuel Freeman, reined up alongside. The stage, his buffalo soldiers falling in behind him. The captain's dark face was weathered by years of frontier service. Marshal Wade said you might come this way. Didn't expect an escort. Freeman's smile was grim. Not an escort. Warning. Apache aren't the only ones using these trails now. Ghost. Riders have been through here 3 days back, left their mark. He handed up a piece of paper, grey ribbon attached. The message was simple. All debts come due. They're watching the high routes too, Ezra realized. Smart money says they're watching everything, but they ain't the only ones with eyes. Freeman gestured to the surrounding hills. Apache remembered who helped them during the war, when Confederate raiders tried to push them off their hunting grounds. They remember Lightning Mason. The implications settled like lead in Ezra's stomach. I can't draw them into this fight, Sam. Way I hear it, a fight's coming whether we draw lines or not. Vance's boys shot up 2 Apache families last week, claiming they were harboring Union sympathizers. Freeman spat in the dust. Man's starting a war he can't control. The Smiths had fallen silent, listening. They understood what this meant. Vance wasn't just targeting individuals anymore. He was willing to ignite larger conflicts to achieve his goals. There's a waterhole 3 hours ahead, Freeman continued. Apache calls it Shadow Spring. Good place to rest the team if you're of a mind. Might find some friendly faces there. As they approached Shadow Spring, the landscape grew more treacherous. Narrow passes wound between towering rocks, perfect for ambush. But Ezra noticed something else, fresh tracks leading away from the main trail, signs of horses being led carefully to hide their numbers. The spring itself lay in a natural bowl, sheltered by overhanging rocks. As they descended, figures emerged from the shadows, a mix of Apache warriors and weather-beaten white men. Ezra recognized some faces from the war years, scouts, runners, men who'd helped the Union cause not out of loyalty to any flag, but because they'd seen the darkness in men like Vance. "Long way from your usual route," a gravelly voice called. Out. Joshua Red Cloud stepped into view, his face lined with years, but his eyes sharp as ever. The Apache leader had been an ally during the war, helping move civilians to safety when Confederate raiders struck. But then, the usual times are gone. The old scout switched to Apache, speaking rapidly to his warriors. They nodded, some mounting up to take watching positions in the hills. "My men will guard the approaches," Red Cloud said. "We have what you would call a common enemy." Mr. Smith emerged from the stage, moving with the careful precision of a man used to dangerous situations. "We brought what was requested," he gestured to the strongbox. "Winchester rounds." Red Cloud nodded. "And we bring news. Ghost Riders are gathering, many bands moving toward Amarillo. But they watch the direct routes, expecting you to come that way. Let them watch, Ezra said, while we move our people through the high country. Dangerous game, Red Cloud observed, playing ghost for the ghost hunters. Sometimes the best. A way to fight shadows is to become one. The Apache leader smiled thinly. You always did understand our ways, Lightning Mason. Perhaps that is why you are still alive. As they rested the team and distributed the ammunition, Ezra studied the gathering. Apache warriors and frontier scouts, former Union men and Mexican vaqueros, an alliance born of necessity and sealed with shared enemies. Vance's crusade had awakened more than just old hatreds. It had stirred memories of resistance, of times when survival meant standing together against those who would burn the world for their cause. The war wasn't over, but neither was the fight against its darkest legacies. Shadow Spring faded behind them as the stage climbed higher into Apache territory. The water they'd taken on felt like liquid gold in these heights, where every stream could hide an ambush and every rock could conceal a shooter's nest. "Riders coming fast," Mrs. Smith called from the coach window. "From the north." Ezra spotted them, 4 horses pushing hard through the scrub, but something was off about their gait. As they drew closer, he saw why. 3 riders were Apache, warriors, and between them they half-carried a 4th man, slumped in his saddle. Joshua Red Cloud's hand signal told Ezra these were friendlies. He drew the stage to a halt as the riders approached. "Mason!" the wounded man croaked, his face pale beneath trail dust. "Thank God!" Recognition hit like a physical blow. "Daniel Hawkins!" The last time he'd seen Marshal Wade's deputy, the man, had been wearing cavalry clothes at Fort Davis. Now his shirt was soaked with blood. "Ghost riders," Hawkins managed as the Apache helped him down. 30, maybe more, moving through Canyon Diablo. They've got prisoners. Mr. Smith emerged from the stage, medical bag in hand. His banker's disguise hadn't fooled Ezra. The way he handled bandages spoke of battlefield experience. "Names," Ezra pressed while Smith worked. "Who'd they take?" "Thomas Burke's wife. She survived the hanging and—" Hawkins winced as Smith probed his wound. "Sarah Thompson, from Rattlesnake Junction." The world seemed to tilt beneath Ezra's feet. Sarah, the postmaster's daughter who'd grown up watching him drive stages, who'd seen through his quiet facade to the man beneath. "They hit the junction?" His voice was deadly calm. "No, ambushed her stage on the low road. They knew she'd try to warn the others on the list." Hawkins grabbed Ezra's arm. "Vance is gathering them all, taking them to Amarillo. Says he's going to hold court, try them for crimes against the Confederacy." The Apache warrior who'd helped carry Hawkins spoke in his native tongue. Red Cloud had taught Ezra enough to understand. Ghost riders were changing the game, taking hostages to force confrontations. "How long?" Ezra asked. 3 days until the trial begins. They're moving slow, showing their prisoners in every town they pass, building support for their cause. Mrs. Smith appeared from the coach. "We have to warn the others on the list. If Vance is really holding a trial—" "It won't be a trial," Ezra cut in. "It'll be an execution, his way of announcing that the war's starting again." The Apache warriors conferred briefly, then their leader stepped forward. He was younger than the others, but his bearing spoke of authority. He introduced himself as Black Horse, Red Cloud's son. "My father sends words with us," he said in careful English. "Ghost riders have broken peace with Apache people, killed our families, burned our camps. We will help you stop them." It was an unprecedented offer. The Apache rarely involved themselves in white men's quarrels, preferring to defend their own territories and let others fight their wars. "This is more than a raid," Black Horse continued. "These Ghost Riders, they want to burn everything that stands against them. Apache understands such men. They must be stopped or they will destroy all peace." Hawkins struggled to sit up. Marshal Wade's gathering of men at Fort Stockton. Cavalry's ready to move. But they're waiting on word from you, Mason. You know Vance, know how he thinks, and he knows me, Ezra replied softly. I know I won't let him hurt innocent people. He's counting on that. The wounded deputy nodded. It's a trap. Of course, it is, but sometimes you have to spring a trap to catch the trapper. Mr. Smith finished bandaging Hawkins's wound. What's your play, Mason? Ezra studied the harsh landscape around them. Apache country had its own rules, its own ways of waging war. Vance was expecting him to come charging in with cavalry and marshals, a direct assault on Amarillo. But there were other paths, other ways of fighting. Black Horse, he turned to the Apache leader. Your warriors know these highlands better than any man alive. Could you get a small group past Ghost Rider lines? Into Amarillo unseen? The young chief's eyes gleamed with understanding. Like smoke on the wind, they would never know. And the cavalry, Hawkins asked, let them come the way Vance expects, down the main road flying their colors, while his eyes are fixed on them. Mrs. Smith caught on. The Apaches slip in through the shadows, along with a few others who know how to move quietly, Ezra added. Men who fought this kind of war before. It was a desperate plan, mixing cavalry charges with Apache stealth, formal troops with shadow warriors, the kind of strategy that could either win everything or lose it all in a single night. Sarah Thompson, Ezra said quietly. What message did Vance send with her? Hawkins pulled a crumpled paper from his shirt. Like the others, a grey ribbon was attached, but this message was different. Come prove your innocence, Lightning Mason. Court convenes at sunset 3 days hence. Justice will be served. The words might as well have been written in Sarah's blood. Vance had chosen his hostage carefully, knowing that the quiet stage driver would risk everything to save her. 3 days, Ezra mused. Time enough to gather. What we need, time enough to remind some folks what we're fighting for. Black Horse barked orders to his warriors. 2 rode east, carrying messages to Red Cloud. The 3rd began scouting their path ahead. What about the stage? Mrs. Smith asked. The regular route ends here, Ezra replied. Time to wake old ghosts of our own. He helped Hawkins into the coach, then turned to the Smiths. I'm going to need your help, both of you. There are men scattered across this territory. Former soldiers, scouts, people who remember what it means to fight from the shadows. And the Apache? Mr. Smith glanced at Black Horse. Can we trust them? Trust isn't about liking someone, Ezra said. It's about knowing where they stand. The Apache have chosen their ground, same as us. The stage rolled on, but now it carried more than mail and passengers. It carried the seeds of resistance, the first threads of a plan that would either save lives or end them. 3 days until Vance's mockery of justice began. 3 days to gather allies, position forces, and prepare for a battle that would determine whether the ghosts of war would rule the future or finally be laid to rest. The sun climbed higher, burning away morning shadows. Somewhere ahead, Sarah, Thompson, and the other prisoners were being moved toward their fate, but they weren't alone. Help was coming, wearing many faces, moving through many shadows. The war wasn't over. But maybe, just maybe, this time they could end it right. Black Horse studied a rough map drawn in the dirt. There are paths through the high country. Old ways, known only to Apache. Ghost Riders would never think to watch them. How many warriors could move unseen? Ezra asked. 20, maybe 30. More would draw attention. The young chief's finger traced lines across the makeshift map. But we would need to cross open ground here near the old mission. Mr. Smith knelt beside them. I know that place. Used it during the war to cache supplies. The cellars are still there, hidden. Perfect staging point, Ezra nodded. How long will it take to get word to Wade's men at Fort Stockton? 2 days, riding hard. Hawkins managed from his place in the shade. But coordinating the timing? Leave that to us, Mrs. Smith interrupted. From her traveling bag, she produced a set of brass signal mirrors. The resistance used these during the war. On clear days, you can pass messages 20 miles or more. The pieces were falling into place. Apache warriors moving through shadow. Paths, cavalry massing for a frontal assault. And between them, a network of signals to coordinate their movements. One problem remains, Black Horse said quietly. The prisoners. Ghost Riders will kill them at the first sign of attack. Ezra's hand tightened on his gun belt. That's where I come in. Vance wants me in that courthouse. I want to make a show of passing judgment, a distraction, Mr. Smith realized. While you keep their attention, the Apache moved into position, and when the cavalry hits their lines, we strike from within, Black Horse finished. His eyes held new respect for the strategy. A good plan, if it works. If it doesn't, a lot of good people die. Ezra stood, brushing dust from his knees, including Sarah. Mrs. Smith touched his arm gently. You care for her. She deserves better than being used as bait in Vance's vendetta. Then we make sure she survives it. Her voice carried the steel of someone who'd lost too much to war already. All of them. As night fell, the group made final preparations. Apache scouts brought word of Ghost Rider movements while Smith worked on detailed maps of Amarillo. The signal mirrors were tested, flashing coded messages across darkening valleys. Ezra found himself atop a ridge with Black Horse, watching distant campfires that marked enemy positions. The young Apache leader spoke of his father's teachings, about patience and the right moment to strike. The conversation turned to Vance, a mountain lion who'd tasted human blood and could never go back to hunting deer. In the camp below, Mrs. Smith taught Hawkins the mirror signals needed to coordinate with Wade's forces. The wounded deputy was recovering his strength, driven by determination to see justice done. Near midnight, Mr. Smith approached with fresh coffee and news. His network of contacts had confirmed Vance's movements. The Ghost Riders were indeed gathering in Amarillo, turning the courthouse into a fortress of their twisted cause. Dawn's coming soon, Black Horse observed as the stars wheeled overhead. The spirits say blood will flow in Amarillo. Let's hope it's the right blood this time, Ezra replied, checking his gun one last time. The Colt felt heavy with purpose, like it knew what was coming. Tomorrow would begin the deadly dance, Apache warriors slipping through shadow paths, cavalry masses drawing attention, and at the center, a stage driver walking willingly into his enemy's trap. Because sometimes the only way to end a nightmare was to embrace it one last time, and pray you had the strength to wake up when it was over. Dawn painted the eastern sky blood red as Ezra saddled his horse. The stage had been hidden in a box canyon, too conspicuous for what lay ahead. From here on, they would move like Apache, swift, silent, and unseen. First signal from Fort Stockton, Mrs. Smith reported, her signal mirror catching early light. Marshal Wade's forces are in position. They'll begin their advance at noon. Black Horse materialized from the shadows, his warriors ghosting behind him. My scouts report Ghost Rider patrols along the main roads, but the high paths remain clear. They're watching for cavalry, Mr. Smith observed, checking his weapons. Not Apache. Their mistake, Black Horse smiled grimly. Not their last. Ezra studied the rough map they'd refined overnight. 3 routes into Amarillo, the main road where Wade's cavalry would make their demonstration, the high paths where Apache warriors would slip through, and the old smuggler's trail that would take Ezra and the Smiths to the mission cellars. Remember, he addressed the gathered fighters, timing is everything. Wade's cavalry draws their attention north. Apache warriors move in from the east. We infiltrate from the south. No one moves until all pieces are in place. And the prisoners, Mrs. Smith asked, her voice tight with concern for Sarah and the others. They'll be in the courthouse. Vance will want them visible for his trial, proof of his power. Ezra checked his Colt one final time. That's where I come in. Blackhorse gripped his arm in the Apache way. "My warriors will be ready. When the signal comes, no mercy," Ezra finished. These men chose their path. The group separated, each taking their assigned routes. Ezra led the Smiths along the smuggler's trail, a barely visible track that wound through narrow canyons. The path had been used during the war to move supplies past Confederate patrols. Now it would serve one final mission. Around midday, they heard distant hoofbeats, Wade's cavalry making their presence known. Ghost Rider patrols would be rushing north, drawn by the threat of federal troops. "Signal from the high ground," Mrs. Smith whispered, catching a flash of light. "Apache warriors in position." The old mission appeared through the heat shimmer, its adobe walls crumbling, but its cellars intact. As they approached, Ezra noted fresh signs. Ghost Riders had indeed missed this approach, their attention fixed on more obvious threats. Inside the cool darkness of the cellars, Mr. Smith retrieved cached weapons, rifles and ammunition hidden during the war. "Never thought we'd need these again." "War never really ended," Ezra replied, helping distribute the arms. "Just went to sleep for a while." Through gaps in the mission walls, they could see Amarillo's courthouse rising above the town. Ghost Riders patrolled the streets, their grey ribbons visible even at this distance. But their movements had changed, more focused north, where Wade's cavalry threatened. "They're gathering for defense," Mr. Smith observed. "Exactly as we hoped." Another signal flashed from the hills, Apache warriors reporting Ghost Rider positions. The pieces were moving into place, the trap slowly closing. But Ezra's thoughts kept returning to Sarah, wondering what she must be enduring in Vance's custody. "You're thinking about her," Mrs. Smith said quietly. "Thinking I should have seen this coming. Protect her better." "Some things we can't protect. People from. All we can do is be there when they need us most." The afternoon wore on, sun baking the adobe walls as they waited for the final signals. Through their spyglass, they counted Ghost Riders, nearly 40 now, concentrated around the courthouse. More than expected, but not enough to change the plan. "Movement at the courthouse," Mr. Smith reported. "They're bringing out prisoners." Ezra's hands tightened on his rifle as he watched Sarah and the others being led onto the courthouse steps. Even at this distance, he could see she held herself with dignity, refusing to be broken by her captors. "Vance is making his appearance," Mrs. Smith added. "Full Confederate general's uniform. He's putting on quite a show." "Good." Ezra checked his weapons one final time. "Let him have his theater. Makes our job easier." The sun was touching the western horizon when the final signal came, 3 quick flashes from the hills. Apache warriors were in their final positions. Wade's cavalry had drawn off enough Ghost Riders to thin their defenses. "Time," Ezra said simply. They moved through deepening shadows, using the town's back alleys just as they had during the war. Here and there, they caught glimpses of other shadows moving. Apache warriors slipping into position, as silent as death itself. The courthouse square was packed with townsfolk, drawn by Vance's promised spectacle. Ghost Riders ringed the crowd, their grey ribbons like battle flags in the dying light. "Remember," Ezra whispered to his companions, "when the shooting starts, get to Sarah and the other prisoners. Get them clear at all costs." "What about you?" Mrs. Smith asked. Ezra's eyes were fixed on Vance, standing proud in his general's uniform. "I've got an appointment with justice." The sun touched the horizon. In the distance, cavalry bugles sounded, and in the shadows of Amarillo, the ghosts of war prepared for one final battle. From their position in the courthouse square's shadows, Ezra could read the tension in Sarah's bearing. She stood straight backed among the prisoners, her eyes scanning the crowd, looking for him, he realized, knowing he would come. Vance began his speech, his voice carrying across the square. "Good people of Amarillo, you stand witness today to true justice, not the false peace imposed by federal bayonets, but the justice of righteous vengeance. The crowd shifted uneasily. Many wore grey ribbons, but others looked uncomfortable with the spectacle before them. They were frontier folks who'd tried to put the war behind them, only to have its ghosts rise again. These prisoners, Vance continued, gesturing to Sarah and the others, aided and abetted enemies of the Confederacy, helped those who would destroy our way of life, and their ringleader, the infamous Lightning Mason, hides in the shadows like the coward he is. Quite a performance, Mr. Smith muttered. He's playing to more than just this crowd. Ezra nodded, sending a message to everyone who opposed the Confederacy: submit or suffer. Through her signal mirror, Mrs. Smith caught a final message from the hills. Apache are ready. They're seeing Ghost Rider reinforcements arriving from the north, but fewer than expected. Wade's cavalry must have engaged them. The pieces were set. Ezra could feel the familiar calm settling over him. The stillness that came before violence erupted. He'd hoped never to know this feeling again, but some choices weren't his to make. Remember, he whispered to his companions, when it starts, don't watch for me. Focus on getting the prisoners clear. The Apache will provide cover, but you'll need to move fast. And Vance? Mr. Smith asked. Leave him to me. Ezra checked his Colt one final time. Time to end this ghost story. As Vance continued his speech, Ezra caught Sarah's eye across the square, just for a moment, but long enough to see the recognition there, the relief, the trust. The sun slipped lower, shadows lengthening across the courthouse square. Soon those shadows would erupt with Apache warriors. Soon the evening air would fill with gun smoke and vengeance. Through his spyglass, Ezra noted Ghost Rider positions. Most were focused outward, watching for Wade's cavalry. Only a handful guarded the prisoners. Vance's arrogance would be his undoing. A flicker of movement in an upper window caught his attention. Black Horse's warriors were already infiltrating the courthouse. Like smoke through cracks, they were getting into position. Mrs. Smith had touched his arm. Last signal from Wade. They're engaging the Ghost Rider reinforcements. It's time. Ezra took one final look at Sarah, standing proud despite her captivity. Then he stepped out of the shadows, into the courthouse square, his voice cutting through. Vance's speech. You want Lightning Mason? Here I am. The courthouse square fell silent as Ezra's words cut through Vance's speech. Ghost Rider's hands dropped to their guns, but didn't draw. Their leader had been clear about wanting this moment. Mason! Vance's smile was cold as a rattler's. I knew you'd come. A man like you can't help playing the hero. Not here for heroics, General. Ezra walked forward slowly, his own hands well away from his gun. Just here to see justice done. Justice? Vance descended the courthouse steps, his cavalry boots clicking on wood. You dare speak of justice? You, who murdered Confederate officers? Who helped runaway slaves and Union sympathizers escape their rightful punishment? The crowd pressed back, forming a circle around the two men. In their faces, Ezra saw the same tension he'd witnessed during the war. People caught between old loyalties and new realities, forced to choose sides when all they wanted was peace. The war's over, Vance, Ezra said quietly. Been over a long time. The war will never be over while traitors like you draw breath. Vance's composure cracked. You think hiding behind a stage driver's peaceful life erases your crimes? The blood you spilled? Careful, General. Start talking about spilled blood. Might have to mention those civilian supplies you raided. Those farmers you shot, those families you burned out. A murmur ran through the crowd. Even among those wearing grey ribbons, such actions didn't sit well with frontier justice. Lies, Vance snapped. Union propaganda. Truth has a way of surviving, Ezra replied. Like those people you're holding, innocent folks whose only crime was helping others in need. Sarah caught his eye again. She'd understood immediately what he was doing, using Vance's own theatrical instincts against him, keeping him focused on their confrontation while other pieces moved into place. Innocent? Vance laughed harshly. They're collaborators, enemies of the true South, and you— His hand dropped to his gun. You're their ringleader, their curse, their doom. No. Ezra's voice carried across the square. I'm just a stage driver. Been 5 peaceful years, but before that— His eyes hardened. Before that, I was Lightning Mason, and I reckon you're about to remember why. The tension stretched like a bowstring at full draw. In the deepening shadows, Apache warriors waited. The Smiths were in position near the prisoners. Wade's cavalry would be pressing the Ghost Rider reinforcements hard. You really think you can win this? Vance's smile returned, colder than ever. Look around, Mason. My men have this square surrounded. One wrong move, and your precious innocents die first. Might want to count again, General. Ezra nodded slightly. Shadows are getting mighty crowded. Vance's eyes narrowed, finally registering the danger. But before he could shout a warning, war cries split the evening air. Apache warriors seemed to materialize from every shadow, their first arrows taking Ghost Riders completely by surprise. The crowd scattered as gunfire erupted. The Smiths moved with precise efficiency, using the chaos to reach the prisoners. Sarah was already in motion, helping the others break free despite their bonds. But Ezra's focus remained on Vance. The general's draw was lightning fast, his first, a shot catching Ezra's sleeve as the stage driver dove for cover behind a water trough. You never could face me directly, Vance shouted over the gunfire. Always hiding, always striking from the shadows. Says the man who burns civilian homes, Ezra replied, squeezing off 2 shots that kept Vance pinned behind a pillar. Who hangs innocent people to provoke his enemies? Around them, the battle raged. Apache warriors moved like smoke through the chaos, their arrows and knives finding Ghost Rider targets with deadly precision. The Smiths had reached the prisoners, using the courthouse itself as cover while they worked on the bonds. The Confederacy will rise again. Vance's voice carried the edge of madness now. Through blood and fire, we'll restore what was lost. The Confederacy's dead, General. Ezra's words cut through the noise. All you're raising is ghosts, and ghosts need to rest. A new sound joined the battle, cavalry bugles closer now. Wade's men had broken through, pushing the Ghost Rider reinforcements back toward town. The trap was closing. But Vance wasn't finished. With a roar of defiance, he broke from cover, both guns blazing. Ezra felt one bullet crease his ribs. Another, kick splintered from the trough beside his head. Time seemed to slow. The same deadly calm that had earned him his nickname settled over Ezra. His first shot knocked one of Vance's guns away. His second caught the general high in the chest, spinning him halfway around, but Vance didn't fall. With inhuman determination, he raised his remaining gun, aiming not at Ezra but at Sarah, who was helping the last prisoner to safety. The third shot from Ezra's Colt took Vance between the eyes. The general's last bullet went high, harmlessly, into the darkening sky. For a moment, Vance remained standing, a look of complete surprise on his face. Then he toppled backward, his general's uniform stained with the same red that had stained so many innocent lives. "Mason!" Black Horse's voice cut through the gunfire. "Ghost Riders are breaking. Cavalry's got them boxed in." The battle wasn't over. Pockets of resistance remained. Ghost Riders fighting with the desperate fury of men who knew their cause was lost. But their leader was dead, their strategy in shambles. Sarah reached Ezra's position, her hands still raw from the ropes. "Knew you'd come," she said simply. "Had to," he replied. "Some debts need paying." Around them the shooting was dying down. Wade's cavalry had sealed the exits, while Apache warriors hunted down the last Ghost Riders, trying to hide in Amarillo's shadows. The war was finally, truly ending. But as Ezra helped Sarah to safety, he wondered about the price of peace, and whether some ghosts could ever really rest. "We need to move." Black Horse appeared beside them, bow still in hand. More ghost riders could be coming from the outlying. "Camps! The prisoners?" Ezra asked. "Safe. Mrs. Smith is treating their injuries at the mission. Mr. Smith and my warriors are securing the perimeter." Sarah touched Ezra's wounded side. "You're bleeding. Just a graze. Had worse." His eyes swept the courthouse square, taking in the aftermath. Bodies lay where they'd fallen, grey ribbons stained darker now. Among the dead, he recognized faces from wanted posters, men who'd chosen to follow Vance's madness to its bitter. And Marshal Wade rode in with the last of his cavalry, their horses lathered from hard fighting. "Got most of their reinforcements," he reported. "Few slipped away south, but they won't be coming back, not without Vance." "His death changes everything," Sarah observed. "These men followed him because he promised them glory, revenge. Without that, they're just lost souls," Ezra finished, "haunting a world that's moved on without them." The townspeople were emerging from hiding, looking shell-shocked at what their quiet streets had witnessed. Some began tending the wounded, others helped clear debris. The battle's fury was already becoming a memory. "My father would be proud," Sarah said quietly. "He always said you were more than just a stage driver." "Was hoping to be less," Ezra replied. "Thought Lightning Mason could rest." "Some legends don't rest," Black Horse interjected. "They wait, like thunder in distant hills, until they're needed." Again, Wade's men were gathering Ghost Rider survivors, those who'd surrendered when Vance fell. Their faces showed the empty look of men who'd lost not just a battle, but a reason for fighting. Mrs. Smith emerged from the mission, her medical bag stained with fresh blood. "All prisoners will recover. Some took rough handling, but nothing. We'll heal." "And the town?" Ezra asked. "Already talking about rebuilding. Some of those who wore grey ribbons are helping tend wounded Apache warriors. Maybe there's hope after all." A young Ghost Rider, barely more than a boy, was led past in irons. He stared at Vance's body, then at Ezra. "You killed him," he said, voice hollow. "Killed our last chance to make things right. Right and revenge." "Ain't the same thing, son," Ezra replied. "War's over. Time to find a new way to live." The boy's shoulders slumped as he was led away. In his defeat, Ezra saw hope, the possibility that some, at least, might learn to let go of old hatreds. "Stage leaves for Rattlesnake Junction tomorrow morning," he announced, surprising them all. "Mail still needs delivering." Sarah smiled, understanding. "Some things don't change. Shouldn't change," he agreed. "That's what we fought for. The right to live simple lives, drive honest routes, carry letters between folks who just want to get on with living." But his gun would stay close now, and his eyes would watch the shadows. Peace had been bought with blood once again, and someone had to stand ready to defend it. The quiet life would go on, but with a difference, the knowledge that Lightning Mason wasn't just a legend from the past, but a promise for the future. The last light faded from Amarillo's sky as they made their way to the mission. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new routes to ride, but for now they had won their victory, paid their price, and laid some ghosts to rest. Even if others still waited in the shadows, watching, remembering, planning their own return from death's dark borders. Dawn painted Amarillo's courthouse with fresh colors, washing away the night's shadows. Ezra stood at the stage's reins, checking harnesses with the same care he'd shown every morning for 5 years. Some rituals survived even the worst storms. "Sure you want to make this run?" Marshal Wade asked, his badge catching early light. "Wounds could use more rest." "Mail needs delivering," Ezra replied simply. "Stage won't drive itself." Sarah emerged from the mission, carrying her father's old mailbag. The prisoners they'd rescued had been moved to Fort Davis under cavalry escort, but she'd chosen to stay. Some choices spoke louder than words. "Got company for the trip?" Wade nodded toward approaching riders. Black Horse led a small group of Apache warriors, their faces painted for travel rather than war. "My father sends word," the young chief announced. "Apache will watch the high trails. Ghost riders who escaped may try to rebuild their strength." "Your people don't owe us anything," Ezra said. Black Horse smiled. "We owe peace a chance to grow, like grass after fire." The Smiths appeared next, their banker's disguises discarded. Mrs. Smith carried fresh medical supplies, while her husband checked weapons with professional care. "Heading back to Fort Stockton?" Ezra asked. "Eventually," Mr. Smith replied, "but thought we'd ride along to Rattlesnake Junction first. Make sure the road's clear." Wade's deputy, Hawkins, joined them, his wound healing clean. "Got word from Judge Cole in Austin. He's recovering, sending marshals to every town that sheltered ghost riders, making sure the message is clear." "And the message?" Sarah asked, though she knew the answer. "War's over. For good this time. Anyone tries to resurrect it." He glanced. "Advance his fresh grave beyond the town limits." Well, they saw what happened. The morning stage brought news from surrounding towns. Ghost Rider sympathizers were surrendering their grey ribbons, returning to the quiet lives they'd known before Vance's madness took hold. The fever of revenge was breaking, leaving clarity in its wake. "Found this in Vance's effects," Wade handed Ezra a leather-bound journal. "Makes for interesting reading. Names, dates, plans for rebuilding the Confederacy town by town. Man was building more than just a revenge plot." "He was building a dream," Ezra replied, paging through the journal. "Problem was, it was a dream that died at Appomattox. He just couldn't let it rest." Sarah read over his shoulder. "There are more names here, other leaders who supported his cause." "Already being handled," Wade assured them. "Armies moving quietly, but thoroughly. By the time they're done, there won't be any ground left for ghosts to rise from." The Apache warriors had gathered intel during the night. Ghost Rider survivors were scattered, leaderless, many turning themselves in at remote army posts. Without Vance's vision to unite them, the movement was dissolving like morning mist. "Time to roll," Ezra announced, climbing to the driver's box. Sarah joined him as natural as sunrise. Black Horse raised his hand in farewell. "We will watch the high paths. Some ghosts take longer to fade." The Smiths mounted up, taking flanking positions. They might look like ordinary travelers to most eyes, but Ezra knew better. The old network was reforming, adapting, becoming something new, not just resistance fighters, but guardians of the peace they'd won. "One last thing," Wade called up. "Army's offering you a position. Scout captain, good pay, chance to keep protecting folks." Ezra shook his head. "Already got a job. Stage needs driving." "And if more ghosts rise, then Lightning Mason will still be here. Just have to know where to look." The stage rolled out under the morning sun, wheels raising dust that glowed like gold. Behind them, Amarillo was already changing, townspeople working together to repair battle damage, former enemies, finding common ground in the simple act of rebuilding. Sarah's shoulder touched his as she handled the brake. "Think it's really over?" "The war? Been over a long time. Just took some folks longer to accept it." He checked the sun's position, calculating their arrival at the first swing station. "But the need for good people to stand watch, that's never over." The Apache shadows paced them through the high country, invisible but present. The Smiths rode steady on their flanks, professional guardians playing the role of casual travelers. And somewhere ahead, Rattlesnake Junction waited, its quiet streets and simple lives a reminder of what they'd fought to protect. Ezra touched, his healing wounds, feeling the price of peace in every twinge. But as the stage rolled on, eating miles with steady purpose, he knew he'd found his answer. Some ghosts never truly died, but they could be bound by stronger chains than hatred. By duty, by love, by the simple commitment to deliver the mail, come hell or high water. The war was over. The stage rolled on, and in the space between, Lightning Mason would wait, ready if the shadows ever stirred again. The day's heat built slowly as they crossed familiar territory. At each swing station, Ezra noted changes, new faces among the station hands, fresh fortifications subtle enough to escape casual notice, Apache scouts moving like wind through the high grass. Networks growing, Sarah observed as they changed teams at Coyote Wells. Station masters passing messages, traders carrying more than just goods. Peace needs tending, Ezra agreed. Like any garden. The Smiths had separated briefly, checking back trails and possible ambush points. When they rejoined the stage, their report was encouraging. Former Ghost Rider camps stood empty, their occupants scattered to the winds. Found this, though. Mr. Smith handed over a weathered piece of paper, another grey ribbon, but this one bore different words. The dream never dies. No, Ezra folded the paper carefully. But dreamers wake up, sooner or later, have to face the morning sun. They crossed Wolf Creek as afternoon shadows lengthened. The spot where Ezra had first encountered Blackwood's men seemed ages ago, though barely a week had passed. Time moved differently in war, he reflected, fast as gunsmoke, slow as healing wounds. "Rider coming," Sarah called, shading her eyes. "Fast, from the junction." It was Tommy Williams, the station master's son, pushing his pony hard. The boy's face showed excitement rather than fear as he approached. "Mr. Mason, Pa sent me to meet you. Judge Cole's back in Austin, holding court again. Says the Ghost Riders who surrendered are being offered pardons if they swear to keep the peace." "Smart move," Mrs. Smith commented. "Give them a way back to normal life." "Some will take it," Ezra said. "Others won't. That's why we keep watching." Tommy's news continued. Marshal Wade was establishing a new ranger company, mixing cavalry veterans with Apache scouts. Black Horse would serve as their guide in the high country, building bridges between worlds that had once been separated by fear and misunderstanding. As Rattlesnake Junction appeared on the horizon, Porter Williams stood proud despite his bandaged arm. He'd fought when Ghost Riders tried to take the station. The town had rallied behind him, showing that some bonds ran deeper than old war. "Loyalties. Stage is running," Porter announced with quiet pride. "Always has, always will." That evening, Sarah found Ezra at his desk, adding to a leather-bound journal. Names, places, signs to watch for. The old resistance network was becoming something new, preserving peace instead of fighting wars. "You could still take that army commission," she said softly. "No one would blame you." Ezra closed the journal, looking at the woman who'd seen through his quiet facade from the start. "Some legends need to stay quiet," he replied. "Work better that way. And some need to drive stages. Someone has to." He smiled. "Mail won't deliver itself." In the station yard, the next day's stage waited, ready for another dawn. The war's ghosts might never fully rest, but they could be kept at bay by those who remembered, those who watched, those who understood that peace was worth protecting. Lightning Mason's gun would stay close, but for now, Ezra Mason had mail to deliver. And sometimes, he reflected, that was the greatest victory of all. A month after Amarillo, changes had settled into Rattlesnake Junction like dust after a storm. The stage station boasted subtle improvements. Reinforced walls, better sightlines, hidden rifle ports that most folks would never notice. Porter Williams had rebuilt with the future in mind. Apache scouts reported in. Sarah handed Ezra the morning manifests. All quiet on the high trails. Even found 2 more Ghost Rider camps abandoned. Empty long? Weeks, by the look. Seems your message got through. The message had spread far beyond Texas. Marshal Wade's reports told of Ghost Rider surrenders across 4 states. Men choosing pardons over pursuit, peace over vengeance. Vance's death had broken more than just his command. It had shattered the dream that had driven them. Stage routes changing, Porter announced during the morning briefing. The Army wants regular runs to the Apache trading posts, building trust through trade. Black Horse's idea, Ezra asked, his and Wade's. Figure if folks are trading together, they're less likely to fight each other. The station's morning bustle felt different now. Among the regular hands were faces that wouldn't have been welcome before. A former Ghost Rider working off his pardon, an Apache scout teaching tracking skills to the younger men, even one of Wade's deputies permanently stationed to help. Coordinate intelligence. Got a letter from the Smiths, Sarah said, as they loaded the morning stage. They're setting up similar arrangements in Fort Stockton. Networks growing, but quieter now. More about preventing trouble than fighting it. Ezra checked the team's harnesses, the familiar routine grounding him in the present. Best kind of battle is the one that never happens. The morning sun caught something metallic at Sarah's hip, a small derringer, carefully concealed but ready. She wasn't the only one who carried it. The piece they'd won came with watchfulness built in. Heard from Judge Cole, too, she continued. He's prosecuting the last of Vance's officers. Most are taking deals, turning evidence about sympathizers in high places. Cleaning the house properly this time. That's not all. She handed him another letter, this one bearing a government seal. Army still wants you. General thinks having Lightning Mason officially on their rolls would send a message. Already sending a message, Ezra replied, climbing to the driver's box. Every time the stage runs on schedule. Every letter that gets delivered. Every day. Without gunfire, Sarah joined him, taking her accustomed place. Some would say you're wasting your talents driving stages. Some don't understand that peace needs everyday heroes more than legends. He picked up the reins. Besides, stage needs driving. The morning run began like any other, wheels rolling east under a Texas sky. But subtle differences marked the landscape. Apache scouts visible on ridgelines, new cavalry patrols riding regular routes, trading posts flying both Army and tribal flags. At their first stop, they found Tommy Williams practicing with the station's new signal mirrors. The boy had taken to the Resistance Network's ways with natural talent, proving that the next generation was ready to carry the torch. Pa says Ghost Riders tried starting trouble up in Kansas, Tommy reported. Army Rangers and tribal scouts drove them off before they could organize, didn't even need to fire a shot. Best kind of victory, Ezra nodded. Word spread along the stage routes, carried by drivers and passengers, traders and trackers. Lightning Mason still rode the Texas trails, but not as a gunfighter. He'd found a better way to fight, by showing that ordinary life, honestly lived, was stronger than any dream of lost glory. Have you ever missed it? Sarah asked as they crossed Wolf Creek. The excitement, the legend. Ezra watched an Apache scout signal their passage from a distant ridge. Legend's still there, just wearing different clothes, moving different ways. Like a stage driver who reads trail signs and checks for ambushes while delivering mail. Like station masters who pass messages in mail sacks. Like Apache warriors who guard trade routes. Like former enemies who learn to work together. They topped a rise, seeing miles of Texas spread before them. Somewhere out there, other Ghost Riders might be dreaming of revenge, planning their own resurrections. But they'd find a different world waiting, one where peace had put down roots, where everyday heroes stood ready, where legends drove stages and delivered mail. Got a full load today, Sarah checked the manifest. Letters, packages, trade goods for the reservations, and a few other things, Ezra added, knowing some of those packages carried intelligence reports, warnings, the quiet machinery of keeping peace alive. The stage rolled on, wheels marking time like a heartbeat. Behind them, Rattlesnake Junction was changing, growing into something new, Ahead, the trail stretched toward horizons they'd help shape. Some legends never die, Ezra reflected. They just find better ways to live. The war was over, but the work of peace continued. In rumbling stage wheels, in delivered letters, in the quiet vigilance of those who remembered what it cost. And, sometimes in the shadows of evening, folk still whispered stories of Lightning Mason, but not of his gun, of his dedication, his duty, his daily choice to serve peace instead of vengeance. That, he reckoned, was a legacy worth driving toward. As evening approached, they made their final stop at a new trading post near the reservation. Black Horse was there, conferring with both Apache elders and army officers about expanding the trade. Roots, the high paths speak of change, the young chief greeted them. Ghost Rider signs grow fainter. New tracks appear. Traders, peacemakers, those who build rather than destroy. Heard you're training army scouts, Ezra said, helping unload trade goods, and they train us in their ways. Together we see more than either could alone. Black Horse's smile held wisdom beyond his years, like a stage driver who carries more than mail, yes. The trading post highlighted the changes sweeping across Texas. Apache craftsmen traded with frontier merchants while cavalry officers discussed patrol routes with tribal scouts. The barriers between worlds were thinning, replaced by bridges of understanding. Got something for you? Black Horse handed Ezra a small package wrapped in decorated leather. My father sends it with respect. Inside was an Apache medicine pouch, adorned with symbols of protection and vigilance. For the one who walks between worlds, Black Horse explained. Like us, you understand that peace requires both strength and wisdom. Sarah examined the symbols with interest. These mean guardian, don't they? Among other things. In our stories, the most powerful guardians are those who appear ordinary. The wolf who tends his pack, the eagle who watches silently, the stage driver who delivers more than mail. As they prepared for the final leg home, Marshal Wade rode in with news from his latest patrol. More Ghost Rider camps found abandoned, more old soldiers choosing pardons over pursuit. The wave of change was spreading beyond Texas, carried by stage routes and trading posts, by everyday heroes doing everyday work. Funny thing, Wade mused, watching the sunset paint the trading post in gold. Vance wanted to resurrect the past. Instead, he helped birth something new, something better. Futures like that, Ezra replied. Never quite what anyone expects. The stage rolled toward home under emerging stars. Tomorrow would bring another dawn, another route, another chance to prove that peace was built on small actions, quiet courage, and the daily choice to move. Forward instead of back. Lightning Mason's legend had changed, becoming something subtler but no less powerful. Not a tale of gunsmoke and violence, but of dedication, duty, and the strength to choose a different path. Some ghosts never truly fade, but they can be transformed. Like the stage routes that now carried trade instead of war. Like the Apache. Scouts who guarded peace instead of borders. Like the everyday heroes who built tomorrow with each letter delivered, each mile driven. Each small act of faith in a better world. That was the real victory, not one with guns or glory, but with steady hands on the reins, eyes on the horizon, and the quiet courage to drive on toward morning. At the station that night, Sarah found Ezra adding one final entry to his journal, not about threats or warnings, but about hope. About Apache warriors teaching cavalry scouts, about former enemies trading stories instead of bullets, about a stage line that carried dreams of peace, along with its mail. Some stories need telling, she said, reading over his shoulder, to remind us who we are, who we choose to be, he corrected gently. Every day. The lamp burned late as they planned tomorrow's route together. Outside, the Texas night was full of possibility, of new paths waiting to be found, of legends being rewritten by ordinary folk doing extraordinary things. Lightning Mason's gun would stay close, ready if needed. But his legacy would be measured in miles driven, letters delivered, and the quiet example of a man who chose to serve peace one stage run at a time. Some victories, after all, are won not with a single shot, but with 1,000 small choices. Day after day, as regular as the morning stage rolling out toward dawn. 1 year after Amarillo, Ezra Mason stood in Rattlesnake Junction's stage yard, watching dawn paint the horizon. The town had grown, sprouting new buildings and faces, but some things remained constant, like the morning stage, waiting for its run. "Special cargo today," Sarah said, emerging from the station office with a bundle of papers. Judge Cole's final reports on the Ghost Rider trials. The past year had seen justice served, not with hangman's ropes, but with careful judgment. Most of Vance's followers had accepted pardons, returning to peaceful lives. Those who couldn't let go had faced trial, their sentences aimed at reformation rather than revenge. "Got another letter from Black Horse," she continued. "Apache trading posts are flourishing. Even got army contracts now, supplying cavalry posts with local goods." Who'd have thought? Ezra checked the team's harnesses. War Chief's son becoming a businessman. Times change. People too, if you give them a reason. The morning bustle of the station yard proved her point. Former Ghost Riders worked alongside Apache traders, loading freight bound for frontier posts. Marshal Wade's Rangers mixed freely with tribal scouts, sharing intelligence about the territories they jointly protected. "Rider coming," Tommy Williams called from his lookout post. The boy had grown into his responsibilities, handling station security with quiet competence. Flying Army colors. It was Captain Samuel Freeman, his Buffalo Soldiers now part of Wade's Ranger Force. The integration hadn't been easy, but like many changes this past year, it had proven its worth. Bringing news. Freeman dismounted smoothly. "Last of Vance's diehards tried stirring trouble up near El Paso. Local folks shut them down before we even got there, turned them in themselves. People protecting their own peace." Ezra nodded. "Best kind of justice." The morning's passengers began arriving. Merchants bound for Fort Davis, a teacher heading to the reservation school, families moving west toward new opportunities. The stage line had become more than just a mail service. It was a lifeline connecting communities, building bridges between worlds that once stood apart. "Got something else." Freeman handed over a worn piece of paper. "Found it in one of the Ghost Rider camps. Thought you should see it." 1 year after Amarillo, Ezra Mason stood in Rattlesnake Junction's stage yard, watching dawn paint the horizon. The town had grown, sprouting new buildings and faces, but some things remained constant. Like the morning stage waiting for its run. "Special cargo today," Sarah said, emerging from the station office with a bundle of papers. Judge Cole's final reports on the Ghost Rider trials. The past year had seen justice served, not with hangman's ropes, but with careful judgment. Most of Vance's followers had accepted pardons, returning to peaceful lives. Those who couldn't let go had faced trial, their sentences aimed at reformation rather than revenge. "Got another letter from Black Horse," she continued. "Apache trading posts are flourishing, even got army contracts now, supplying cavalry posts with local goods." Who'd have thought? Ezra checked the team's harnesses. War Chief's son becoming a businessman. Times change. People too, if you give them a reason. The morning bustle of the station yard proved her point. Former Ghost Riders worked alongside Apache traders, loading freight bound for frontier posts. Marshal Wade's Rangers mixed freely with tribal scouts, sharing intelligence about the territories they jointly protected. "Rider coming," Tommy Williams called from his lookout post. The boy had grown into his responsibilities, handling station security with quiet competence. Flying Army colors. It was Captain Samuel Freeman, his Buffalo Soldiers now part of Wade's Ranger Force. The integration hadn't been easy, but like many changes this past year, it had proven its worth. Bringing news, Freeman dismounted smoothly. Last of Vance's diehards tried stirring trouble up near El Paso. Local folks shut them down before we even got there, turned them in themselves. People protecting their own peace, Ezra nodded. Best kind of justice. The morning's passengers began arriving. Merchants bound for Fort Davis, a teacher heading to the reservation school, families moving west toward new opportunities. The stage line had become more than just a mail service. It was a lifeline, connecting communities, building bridges between worlds that once stood apart. Got something else? Freeman handed over a worn piece of paper. Found it in one of the Ghost Rider camps. Thought you should see it. It was a grey ribbon, but unlike the others they'd collected, this one had been carefully torn in half. A message, written across the tier, "The war is over. Let it rest." Found a dozen more like it, Freeman added. Seems your example's spreading. Stage driver who chose peace over vengeance, got folks thinking about their own choices. Sarah studied the ribbon. Some legends work better quietly. Speaking of quiet, Freeman smiled. Hear you turned down another Army commission. They're getting persistent. Already got a job, Ezra replied, climbing to the driver's box. Stage. Needs driving, but they all knew it was more than that. The stage line had become something larger, a symbol of the peace they'd built, a reminder that everyday work could matter more than dramatic gestures. As Sarah took her place beside him, Ezra noticed subtle changes in her too. The postmaster's daughter had grown into her own kind of legend, coordinating intelligence networks through seemingly innocent mail routes, helping knit communities together through commerce and communication. You know, she said as they prepared to roll out, some folks still tell stories about Lightning Mason, but they're different now. Not about the gun, but about the choice. About putting down the sword and picking up the reins. Better story that way, Ezra agreed. More useful. The morning stage rolled out under a rising sun. Behind them, Rattlesnake Junction bustled with legitimate commerce. Ahead, the trail stretched toward Fort Davis and beyond, marked by trading posts and way stations where different cultures met in peace. They passed Wolf Creek, where that first confrontation with Blackwood had sparked a chain of events none could have predicted. The spot looked different now, a new trading post under construction, Apache and settler children playing together in the shade. Year ago, Sarah mused, you were worried about ghosts rising. Still am, Ezra replied honestly. Always will be. But now we know better how to lay them to rest. Not with bullets, but with something stronger. What's that? Choice. Every day, every mile, choosing to build instead of break, to deliver instead of destroy, to drive on toward the morning. The stage rolled west under the Texas sun. Behind them, Rattlesnake Junction was growing into something new. Ahead, the frontier waited with its own challenges and opportunities. And somewhere between, Lightning Mason's legend lived on. Not as a tale of violence, but as a reminder that the greatest battles are won in the quiet moments, one choice at a time. Some ghosts never truly fade, but they can be transformed. Like the stage routes that now carried hope instead of fear, like the communities that chose cooperation over conflict, like the everyday heroes who built tomorrow with each letter delivered, each mile driven, each small act of faith in a better world. That was the real victory. Not one with guns or glory, but with steady hands on the reins, eyes on the horizon, and the quiet courage to drive on toward morning, one stage run at a time. The war was over. The peace had been won. And somewhere in the vast Texas landscape, a stage driver named Ezra Mason kept rolling toward dawn, carrying mail, memories, and the promise of a future worth protecting. For some legends never die. They just find better ways to live. Years later, folks would still tell stories about the morning stage and its quiet driver. They'd speak of Apache scouts who rode the high trails not for war but for peace, of trading posts where old enemies became new partners, of a network of Everyday heroes who kept watch while building something new. They'd tell of Sarah Thompson, who turned a simple mail route into a web of communication that bound communities together. Of Black Horse, who proved that a warrior's greatest victory could come through trade rather than battle. Of Marshall Wade's Rangers, who learned that justice worked better with open hands than closed fists. But mostly, they'd tell of a stage driver named Ezra Mason, who showed that the hardest battles are won not with guns but with choices. Who proved that some legends serve better in silence, and that true courage often wears the simple clothes of daily duty. The stage still runs those Texas routes, carrying mail and memories, hope and possibility. And on quiet mornings, if you listen careful-like, you might hear wheels rolling toward dawn, carrying yesterday's ghosts toward tomorrow's peace. Some say Lightning Mason still rides those trails, watching over the quiet folks who build their lives one day at a time. Others say he was just a story, a legend born of troubled times. But in Rattlesnake Junction they know better. They know that the greatest heroes are often the quiet ones, who choose each day to serve something larger than themselves, who understands that peace isn't just the absence of war, but the presence of justice, opportunity, and the courage to choose a better way. The morning stage still rolls out under Texas skies, carrying letters, dreams, and the promise of a future worth protecting. And somewhere on those endless trails, a legend lives on, not in gunsmoke and glory, but in the steady turn of wheels, the quiet keeping of faith, and the endless courage to drive on toward morning. For in the end, the greatest victories are won not in single moments of dramatic choice, but in the 1,000 small decisions that build a life, a community, a future. In the daily work of ordinary heroes who choose again and again to serve the dawn rather than the darkness. That's the real story of Lightning Mason. Not how he fought, but how he chose to live. Not what he left behind, but what he helped to build. And in Texas, where the morning sun still paints the trails with promise, they say that's the finest legend of all. It was a gray ribbon, but unlike the others they'd collected, this one had been carefully torn in half, a message written across the tear. The war is over. Let it rest. Found a dozen more like it, Freeman added. Seems your example's spreading. Stage driver who chose peace over vengeance, got folks thinking about their own choices. Sarah studied the ribbon. Some legends work better quietly. Speaking of quiet, Freeman smiled, here you turned down another Army commission. They're getting persistent. Already got a job, Ezra replied, climbing to the driver's box. Stage needs driving, but they all knew it was more than that. The stage line had become something larger, a symbol of the peace they'd built, a reminder that everyday work could matter more than dramatic gestures. As Sarah took her place beside him, Ezra noticed subtle changes in her too. The postmaster's daughter had grown into her own kind of legend, coordinating intelligence networks through seemingly innocent mail routes, helping knit communities together through commerce and communication. You know, she said as they prepared to roll out, some folks still tell stories about Lightning Mason, but they're different now, not about the gun, but about the choice, about putting down the sword and picking up the reins. Better story that way, Ezra agreed. More useful. The morning stage rolled out under a rising sun. Behind them, Rattlesnake Junction bustled with legitimate commerce. Ahead, the trail stretched toward Fort Davis and beyond, marked by trading posts and way stations where different cultures met in peace. They passed Wolf Creek, where that first confrontation with Blackwood had sparked a chain of events none could have predicted. The spot looked different now. A new trading post under construction, Apache and settler children playing together in the shade. Year ago, Sarah mused, you were worried about ghosts rising. Still am, Ezra replied honestly. Always will be, But now we know better how to lay them to rest, not with bullets, but with something stronger. What's that? Choice. Every day, every mile. Choosing to build instead of break, to deliver instead of destroy, to drive on toward the morning. The stage rolled west under the Texas sun. Behind them, Rattlesnake Junction was growing into something new. Ahead, the frontier waited with its own challenges and opportunities. And somewhere between, Lightning Mason's legend lived on, not as a tale of violence, but as a reminder that the greatest battles are won in the quiet moments, one choice at a time. Some ghosts never truly fade, but they can be transformed. Like the stage routes that now carried hope instead of fear, like the communities that chose cooperation over conflict, like the everyday heroes who built tomorrow with each letter delivered, each mile driven, each small act of faith in a better world. That was the real victory. Not one with guns or glory, but with steady hands on the reins, eyes on the horizon, and the quiet courage to drive on toward morning, one stage run at a time. The war was over. The peace had been won. And somewhere in the vast Texas landscape, a stage driver named Ezra Mason kept rolling toward dawn, carrying mail, memories, and the promise of a future worth protecting. For some legends never die. They just find better ways to live. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload. From us,